Hi, today we're looking at Chapter 2 of the Picture of Dorian Gray. You may remember that previously we looked at the preface, which looked at the nature of art. Then in Chapter 1 we met the artist Basil, his friend Lord Henry. We heard of Dorian and saw him in the portrait. Basil didn't want Henry to meet him. He didn't even want him to know his name. But at the end of that chapter, the butler announced Dorian Gray. That's how Henry found out the name. And now it's too late to stop them from meeting because he's at the door and about to come in. And that's where we pick up the story in Chapter 2. As before, I've highlighted certain bits. As they entered, they saw Dorian Gray. He was seated at the piano with his back to them, turning over the pages of a volume of Schumann's Forest Scenes. This is sheet music. "You must lend me these, Basil," he cried. "I want to learn them. They're perfectly charming." "That entirely depends on how you sit today, Dorian. Sit as a model for being painted." "Oh, I'm tired of sitting, and I don't want a life-sized portrait of myself," answered the lad, swinging round on the music stool in a willful, petulant manner. Petulant is kind of childlike, and we're actually looking for evidence of innocence and childlike qualities in Dorian because, and this is unusual, I think, we've only just met him, but we're going to see in this chapter a complete transformation in Dorian, from innocent, childlike to someone who is aware of his own good looks and someone under the influence of Lord Henry. So this is very quick that we just met him and he's going to do this about turn in his character. So we're looking for childlike, innocent qualities. Petulance is not an attractive quality, but perhaps it has something. It's children who are often petulant. Whining. When he caught sight of Lord Henry, a faint blush coloured his cheeks for a moment, and he started up. "I beg your pardon, Basil, but I didn't know you had anyone with you." Basil introduces them. The aunt, Henry mentions that the aunt knows him. There's old Dorian at the piano. And I'm skipping a lot of the discussion, all of the discussion about the aunt. There's our first description of Dorian. Yes, he was certainly wonderfully handsome, with his finely curved scarlet lips, his frank blue eyes, his crisp gold hair. There was something in his face that made one trust him at once. All the candour or honesty of youth was there, as well as all youth's passionate purity. So there's our evidence of his youth and innocence and purity. One felt that he had kept himself unspotted from the world. No wonder Basil Hallward worshipped him. Basil tries to get rid of Henry, maybe because he knows Henry might be a bad influence. Of course, Harry is short for Henry. "Harry, I want to finish this picture today. Would you think it awfully rude of me if I asked you to go away?" And Henry very cleverly asks Dorian to decide. "Am I to go, Mr. Gray?" "Oh, please don't, Lord Henry. I see that Basil is in one of his sulky moods, and I can't bear him when he sulks." So then Hallward says, "If Dorian wishes it, of course you must stay." And then Henry makes like he's going, but Dorian called him back. "Basil," cried Dorian Gray, "if Lord Henry Wotton goes, I shall go too. You never open your lips while you are painting, and it's horribly dull standing on a platform and trying to look pleasant. Ask him to stay. I insist upon it." So he does. And Basil here says, "And now, Dorian, get up on the platform and don't move about too much or pay any attention to what Lord Henry says. He has a very bad influence over all his friends, with the single exception of myself." So Basil knows of Henry's bad influence. Dorian Gray stepped up on the dais, the platform, with the air of a young Greek martyr, like a Greek statue, and asked Henry, "Have you really a very bad influence, Lord Henry? As bad as Basil says?" and words that have become timeless. Henry says, there is no such thing as a good influence, Mr. Gray. All influence is immoral, immoral from the scientific point of view. This reminds me of what we read in the preface, that there's no such thing as a moral or immoral book, only badly written or well written. So why does he think that that you can't even influence someone in a good way? He says his reason, because to influence a person is to give him one's own soul. He does not think his natural thoughts or burn with his natural passions. And it's important we know Henry's philosophy, because this is what's going to influence Dorian. He says the aim of life is self-development, to realize one's nature perfectly. That is what each of us is here for. People are afraid of themselves nowadays. They've forgotten the highest of all duties, the duty that one owes to one's self. Basil telling Dorian how to move his head, and he's working deep in his work, but he is conscious only that a look had come into the lad's face, the boy's face, that he had never seen there before. So and I'm going back to see, what was it? This talk of morals, the terror of society. Henry's saying we don't have courage to do what we want to do for ourselves anymore because we're too scared of society. And he's saying society is what causes morals. So he says we're too scared of God. That's our religion controls us. These things govern us. Then we're not looking after ourselves. So, it's other things as well that he said, I'm sure. But this is what he's just said. And it's caused a look on Dorian's face that Basil's never seen before. So Basil is seeing Dorian's change from innocence to Lord Henry's creation. More of Lord Henry's philosophy. I believe that if one man were to live out his life fully and completely, were to give form to every feeling, expression to every thought, reality to every dream, I believe that the world would gain such a fresh impulse of joy that we would forget all the maladies, the sicknesses of medievalism, of the Middle Ages, and return to the Hellenic ideal, the ancient Greek ideal, something finer, richer than the Hellenic ideal it may be. But the bravest man amongst us is afraid of himself. So, in other words, he's going to make Dorian think that he's not afraid of himself anymore. He's being brave. But of course, it's going to influence Dorian in other ways. I didn't highlight this. I should have. It's part of what Henry says. We are punished for our refusals, things that we don't do. There's the big line coming up. I mean, this is the same thought. Everything that we want to do and we can't do, he says, poisons us. Every impulse that we strive to strangle broods in the mind and poisons us. Nothing remains then but the recollection of a pleasure or the luxury of regret. Maybe the most famous line in the novel, the only way to get rid of a temptation is to yield to it, give in to it. Resist it, and your soul grows sick with longing for the things it has forbidden to itself, with desire for what its monstrous laws have made monstrous and unlawful. You, Mr. Gray, you yourself with your rose-red youth and your rose-white boyhood, and there's words we can use to describe Dorian's innocence before all this, you have had passions that have made you afraid, thoughts that have filled you with terror, daydreams and sleeping dreams whose mere memory might stain your cheek with shame. Stop! Dorian stops him. He doesn't know what to say. Don't speak, let me think. He stands and thinks, and he's aware that changes are going on inside him. He was dimly conscious that entirely fresh influences were at work within him, yet they seemed to him to have come really from himself. Of course, they came from Henry. The few words that Basil's friend had said to him, words spoken by chance, no doubt, and with willful paradox, intentional paradox in them, had touched some secret chord that had never been touched before. And these words tell us that Henry has been most successful. He's touched a chord in Dorian. Touched some secret chord that had never been touched before, but that he felt was now vibrating like a musical instrument and throbbing to curious pulses. Curious pulses. Compares that to music, mere words compared to music. Words, how terrible they were. Can't escape from them. And he does mention his boyhood and things he had not understood. He understood them now. Life suddenly became fiery colored to him. It seemed to him that he'd been walking in fire. Not sure what to say about that. With his subtle smile, Lord Henry watched him. He knew the precise psychological moment when to say nothing, because he's leaving Dorian time to stew and to think. But he knows he's had an effect. He had merely shot an arrow into the air. Had it hit the mark? Yes, it has. We know that. Basil can see that something is going on. Basil says to Dorian, I don't know what Harry's been saying to you, but he certainly made you have the most wonderful expression. I suppose he's been paying you compliments. You mustn't believe a word that he says. Dorian says, he's certainly not been paying me compliments. Perhaps that's the reason that I don't believe anything he's told me. And that's what he says, but we've seen the words have had an effect. You know you believe it all, said Lord Henry, arrogant and confident that Dorian believes everything that he said, looking at him with his dreamy, languorous eyes. So they go out into the garden, a little break from painting. Basil stays inside to work on his masterpiece. Lord Henry goes outside and he finds Dorian Gray burying his face in the great cool lilac blossoms, feverishly drinking in their perfume as if it had been wine. And you can see he says that Dorian's right to do that. Now, this is a sensory pleasure, taking in the smell of the flowers. So that's going to be part of what Henry advises him to do. You're going to see the words about the senses. We're getting to that. He says, you're quite right to do that, Tim. Here it is. Nothing can cure the soul but the senses, just as nothing can cure the senses but the soul. More of Dorian's looks and hair, gilded gold hair. There was a look of fear in his eyes, such as people have when they are suddenly awakened. Henry's words have somehow awakened Dorian. And there's reminders of his youth, his chiseled nostrils and the scarlet lips. Henry repeats the idea, yes, that's one of the great secrets of life, to cure the soul by means of the senses and the senses by means of the soul. So Dorian reflects on Henry, couldn't help liking him. Got this low, languid voice, is quite interesting. Cool, white flower-like hands. And his hands and his speech are like music and seem to have a language of their own. But he felt afraid of him and ashamed of being afraid. Why had it been left for a stranger to reveal him to himself? He had known Basil Hallward for months, but the friendship between them had never altered him. Suddenly there had come someone across his life who seemed to have disclosed or opened out to him life's mystery. Lord Henry says, let's go sit in the shade. If you stay any longer in this glare, you'll be quite spoilt, and Basil will never paint you again. You really must not allow yourself to become sunburnt. It would be unbecoming, and this is going to introduce a discussion about youth. What can it matter? Cried Dorian Gray, laughing as he sat down. It should matter everything to you, Mr. Gray. Why? Because you have the most marvelous youth, and youth is the one thing worth having. I don't feel that, Lord Henry. No, you don't feel it now. Someday when you are old and wrinkled and ugly, when thought has seared or burnt your forehead with its lines, and passion branded again burnt your lips with its hideous fires, you will feel it. You will feel it terribly. People say sometimes that beauty is only superficial. That may be so, but at least it is not so superficial as thought is. To me, beauty is the wonder of wonders. It is only shallow people who do not judge by appearances, another Oscar Wilde paradox through Henry. The true mystery of the world is the visible, not the invisible. Yes, Mr. Gray, the gods have been good to you, but what the gods give, they quickly take away. You have only a few years in which to live really, perfectly, and fully. When your youth goes, your beauty will go with it, and then you will suddenly discover that there are no triumphs left for you, or have to content yourself with those mean triumphs that the memory of your past will make more bitter than defeats. Every month as it wanes, as your youth fades away, brings you nearer to something dreadful. Time is jealous of you, and wars against your lilies and your roses. You will become sallow and hollow-cheeked and dull-eyed. You will suffer horribly. Realize your youth while you have it. Don't squander the gold of your days, listening to the tedious, trying to improve the hopeless failure, or giving away your life to the ignorant, the common, and the vulgar. These are the sickly aims, the false ideals of our age. Live! Live the wonderful life that is in you. Let nothing be lost upon you. Be always searching for new sensations. Be afraid of nothing. A new hedonism. Hedonism, the belief that we find meaning in pleasure. A new hedonism. That is what our century wants. You might be its visible symbol. So there's the youth argument, there's related to that the hedonism argument. There's nothing you could not do. The world belongs to you for a season. Such a little time that your youth will last. Such a little time. Carrying on about youth doesn't last. The pulse of joy that beats in us at 20 becomes sluggish. Our limbs fail. Our senses rot. We degenerate into hideous puppets, haunted by the memory of the passions of which we were too much afraid, and the exquisite temptations that we had not the courage to yield to. Exquisite temptations are going to come up in this novel. Youth, youth. There is absolutely nothing in the world but youth. So Dorian's watching a bee, thinking about what's been said. The painter calls them. On their way in, Lord Henry says, "You're glad to have met me?" Dorian says, "Yes, I'm glad now." "I wonder, shall I always be glad?" And if you know the whole novel, I guess the answer to that is no. So they go inside. There's the heavy scent of roses seeming to brood over everything. After about a quarter of an hour, Hallward stopped painting, looked for a long time at Dorian Gray, and then for a long time at the picture, biting the end of one of his huge brushes and frowning. "It is quite finished," he cried at last, and he signs the canvas. Henry says, he congratulates Basil and says, "Mr. Gray, come over and look at yourself." The lad started as if awakened from some dream. "It's finished." And this is Dorian's reaction to the painting. When he saw it, he drew back, and his cheeks flushed for a moment with pleasure. A look of joy came into his eyes, as if he had recognized himself for the first time. He stood there motionless and in wonder, dimly conscious that Hallward was speaking to him, but not catching the meaning of his words. So this is where he becomes aware of his own attractiveness. The sense of his own beauty came on him like a revelation. He had never felt it before. Basil Hallward's compliments had seemed to him to be merely the charming exaggeration of friendship. He had listened to them, laughed at them, forgotten them. They had not influenced his nature. Then had come Lord Henry Wotton with his strange panegyric or strange speech on youth, his terrible warning of its brevity or briefness. That had stirred him at the time, and now, as he stood gazing at the shadow of his own loveliness, the full reality of the description flashed across him. Yes, there would be a day when his face would be wrinkled and wizened, shriveled up, his eyes dim and colourless, the grace of his figure broken and deformed. The scarlet or red would pass away from his lips, and the gold steal from his hair. The life that was to make his soul would mar or spoil his body. He would become dreadful, hideous, and uncouth. And this is going to lead him to make this big witch of his that's coming soon, while he's still reacting to what he sees on the canvas. So changes in him through Lord Henry, speaking about youth. Of course, the painting, seeing the painting itself and becoming aware of his own good looks. So he has this thought that strikes him with a sharp pang of pain. He felt as if a hand of ice had been laid upon his heart. "Don't you like it?" cried Hallward, stung a little by the lad's silence, not understanding what it meant. "Of course he likes it," Henry says. "I'll give you anything you ask for it. I must have it. It's not my property, Harry," Basil says. "Whose property is it?" "Dorian's, of course," answered the painter. And here I wish I could double highlight this somehow, because this is really what's going to introduce the rest of the novel, Dorian making this wish. "How sad it is," murmured Dorian Gray, with his eyes still fixed upon his own portrait. "How sad it is. I shall grow old and horrible and dreadful. But this picture will remain always young. It will never be older than this particular day of June. Ah, if it were only the other way. If it were I who was to be always young, and the picture that was to grow old. For that I would give everything." Yes, there is nothing in the whole world I would not give. I would give my soul for that. So, of course, we speak about Faust, the devil is not a character in this novel, but Henry's like the devil, influencing Dorian to make this sale of his soul for the sake of pleasure and his youthful good looks. "You'd hardly care for such an arrangement, Basil," cried Lord Henry, laughing. "It would be rather hard lines on your work. In other words, you wouldn't like it because your painting would get uglier and uglier." Dorian says, "Yes, I'm less to you than your artworks. How long will you like me? Till I have my first wrinkle, I suppose. I know now that when one loses one's good looks, whatever they may be, one loses everything. Your picture has taught me that. Lord Henry Wotton is perfectly right. Youth is the only thing worth having. When I find that I'm growing old, I shall kill myself." "Oh, Dorian, don't talk like that. I've never had such a friend as you, and I shall never have such another. You're not jealous of material things, are you? You who are finer than any of them." Dorian says, "I'm jealous of everything whose beauty does not die. I'm jealous of the portrait you have painted of me. Why should it keep what I must lose? Every moment that passes takes something from me and gives something to it." He makes the wish again. "Oh, if it were only the other way. If the picture could change, and I could be always what I am now. Why did you paint it? It will mock me some day, mock me horribly." He cries, buries his face in the cushions. "This is your doing, Harry." Henry says, "It's the real Dorian Gray, that's all." Basil says, "You should have gone away when I asked you." He says, "I stayed when you asked me." Basil says, "Harry, I can't quarrel with my two best friends at once. But between you both, you've made me hate the finest piece of work I've ever done, and I will destroy it. What is it but canvas and colour? I will not let it come across our 3 lives and mar or spoil them." Dorian Gray lifted his golden head from the pillow and with pallid face and tear-stained eyes looked at him as he walked over to the deal painting table that was set beneath the high-curtained window. What was he doing there? His fingers were straying about among the litter of tin tubes and dry brushes, seeking for something. Yes, it was for the long palette knife, with its thin blade of lithe or flexible steel. He had found it at last. He was going to rip up the canvas. With a stifled sob, Dorian the lad leaped from the couch and, rushing over to Hallward, tore the knife out of his hand and flung it to the end of the studio. "Don't, Basil, don't!" he cried. "It would be murder." "I'm glad you appreciate my work at last, Dorian." "Interesting word, that, murder," said the painter coldly when he'd recovered from his surprise. "I never thought you would. Appreciate it? I'm in love with it, Basil. It is part of myself. I feel that. Well, as soon as you are dry, you shall be varnished and framed and sent home." Basil's sense of humor there. "Then you can do what you like with yourself." Calls the butler for tea. Dorian says, "If you let anyone have it, the painting, but me, Basil, I shall never forgive you," cried Dorian. "And I don't allow people to call me a silly boy. You know the picture's yours, Dorian. I gave it to you before it existed." "And this must be Henry. And you know that you've been a little silly, Mr. Gray, and that you don't really object to being reminded that you're extremely young." Dorian says, "I should have objected very strongly this morning, Lord Henry. Ah, this morning. You have lived since then." And what does he mean by you've lived since then? You've met me, and you've heard my ideas. So now you've lived since this morning. The butler enters with the tea. Henry is suggesting that they go to the theatre, life of the upper class, and even Basil, who's such a nice character, such a bore putting on one's dress clothes, one's tuxedo, one's dress suit, muttered Hallward. "And when one has them on, they're so horrid. Ach, shame." "Yes," answered Lord Henry dreamily. "The costume of the 19th century is detestable. It's so sombre, so depressing. Sin is the only real colour element left in modern life. Sin gives colour." Is that going to be part of his influence on Dorian too? So they didn't invite him to the theatre. He says he wants to come. "I should like to come to the theatre with you." I don't think they invited him, or did they? Said the lad. "Then you shall come, and you will come too, Basil, won't you?" Basil says, "I can't really. I would sooner not. I have a lot of work to do." "Well, then you and I will go alone, Mr. Gray." "I should like that awfully." The painter bit his lip. Maybe he wants to say something there and he doesn't say it. Not going to be happy about this, and walked over cup in hand to the picture. "I shall stay with the real Dorian," he said sadly. Maybe sadly because he can see there's going to be more and more influence from Lord Henry. The real Dorian won't change. He doesn't think that the painting will change. So Hallward tries to stop Dorian from going. "Don't go to the theatre tonight, Dorian. Stop and dine with me." "I can't, Basil." "Why?" "Because I promised Lord Henry." And he begs him, "I beg you not to go," but he says, "Sorry, I must go, Basil." So Basil greets them, promises, makes Dorian promise to come and see him soon. But on the way out, they are stopped by Basil. Basil stops them and warns Harry. And Harry, "Yes, Basil, remember what I asked you when we were in the garden this morning. Don't change him, don't spoil him." Harry says, "I've forgotten it. I trust you." And I should have marked this. Lord Henry says, "I wish I could trust myself," telling us that he can't trust himself. So they go out to fetch a cab. "Goodbye, Basil. It's been a most interesting afternoon." As the door closed behind him, the painter, Basil, flung himself down on a sofa, and a look of pain came into his face, again because he can see Henry is going to influence Dorian for the worse. That's the end of the chapter. In summary, yeah, Henry met Dorian, Dorian's innocence. I should highlight that because we've got to remember Dorian's change in this chapter. That innocence will be lost during this chapter. Basil asks Henry to leave. Dorian insists. Lord Henry has a subtle influence over Dorian, and it begins here. Dorian admires the way the portrait reflects his beauty, but becomes frightened when Lord Henry explains about beauty will fade. He has the wish. Maybe this is the most important thing in the whole chapter, so let's do it in yellow again. He wishes that he could stay young and beautiful forever. The painting should age. I would give my soul for that. Writing to the theatre, Basil staying with a real Dorian. He reminds Lord Henry that he trusts him not to influence Dorian further. I wish I could trust myself. Chapter 2 is a crucial chapter in the novel. We are introduced to Dorian and his physical beauty is described. Quotation like that, the scarlet, the blue eyes, the gold hair. There's his age, about 20, but he's immature, he's a bit sulky, easily upset and spoilt. Lord Henry easily manipulates him. This chapter also introduces the Faustian theme. The Faust story is the idea that a man sells his soul to the devil for worldly success. Here, Dorian selling his soul, we can say, not exactly to Lord Henry, but instead of the devil, and he's doing it for pleasure and experience, but Lord Henry's played up the pleasure. In this adult fable, Dorian sells his soul in exchange for pleasure, knowledge, and power. That's chapter 2. We hope to see you again soon in chapter 3. Bye.